That's recording. So first of all, thanks heaps for coming along tonight, and for showing an interest in the non-physical sides of our yoga practice. For those of you who hasn't been before, just a quick show of hands. Excellent. Well, it's nice to have a few new faces. This is a really informal discussion. It's not a lecture by any stretch of the imagination. So if you have any questions, it's a really good opportunity to ask. If you have any comments that you'd like to add, or if you have any insights of your own that you'd like to share, I encourage you to do so. Just please understand we're not here to lecture each other. We're here to learn from each other because we're all really searching for the same answers to the same questions. We perhaps just ask them in different ways and interpret the answers slightly differently. So, as always, I like to start these discussions with a question from one of you. And Krishna Ananda's given me the doozy of all doozies to start with, but I thought before we do that, I thought I'd see if there's anyone else who has a question that might be a little bit simpler to kick us off. It can be about any aspect of our yoga practice, or it could be a general question about the yoga practice, or it could be something quite specific. So it's entirely up to you. And I'm quite happy to sit here quietly for an hour and a quarter if no one wants to ask a question.
I won't force you into the original question, Steve, which was the definition of love. Steve was going to give us an hour's presentation on that. I thought that might have been a bit hard.
It would be hard to keep it to an hour, or to make it longer than 30 seconds.
That's right. That's all it is. You and I know each other quite well, and you know the people here and that. What's your interpretation, and I'll preface this, about the guru principle in yoga? And I suppose, for want of a better word, we know all the negative sides of, the not so nice gurus and all the negativity that goes on in the world. I wasn't really aiming for that part.
Yeah.
I was more aiming about other people's understanding. A lot of people have, I had no idea around it.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So, for those of you who don't maybe know the word or its meaning, the word guru is the Sanskrit word for, we interpret it as teacher. It more literally means the one that removes darkness, or the one that helps to show us light, or enlighten us would be another way to interpret it. Again, you could interpret Sanskrit in lots of different ways, but it's essentially the one who helps to remove darkness, or confusion would be another way to interpret it. And in the older yoga traditions, if we go back more than, say, 100 years, yoga was traditionally passed down in a very structured teacher-student or guru-disciple kind of method. So as a general rule, and there were exceptions, but as a general rule, if you wanted to study yoga, you would go to live with your guru, with your teacher, and you would stay with them, for a period of years, living in their house, sharing in daily activities with them, often doing their daily chores for them, which was part of the practice. So learning humility is part of that. It's often called karma yoga, the yoga of action, of selfless service. And then over a period of time, the guru would share their insights with the student. And I guess one of the reasons it was done in this way traditionally was to weed out people who had just a sort of fleeting curiosity about what yoga was. So if you actually wanted to learn about it, you actually had to make a commitment. You couldn't just, pop in, pop out, turn up when it suited you. You actually had to make a commitment to study with the teacher, not just for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, but for a period of years, and more or less devote your life to learning the practices and insights of yoga. And that continued really from, sort of several thousand years ago up until maybe 100 years ago or so, when in the modern communication and technology age, starting with radio and television, and also with the advent of transport, particularly air transport, it became much easier for students to reach a teacher who was more remote from them and vice versa. And there's been a lot of good that's come out of that. The teachings have been spread much more widely. But as with most if not all things in life, there's two sides to every coin. So whilst the teachings have become much more widespread, or at least the idea of yoga as a practice has become much more widespread, its understanding, or let's say the understanding of what it is, has become far more diluted, because now we don't have that really direct long-term relationship between a teacher and a student. And I'm not here to say what's good and what's bad. The world unfolds the way the world unfolds. But I do think in our modern yoga world, really the modern yoga circus, it's become much less common to find both teachers who are truly dedicated to the practice of yoga and understand what it is as a spiritual practice, and also students who are dedicated to those deeper aspects of what yoga is. Unfortunately, yoga has become very much in the Western world about a series of physical postures, a series of exercises, without really understanding what the purpose of the asana is, or understanding, in a lot of cases, what that there's even anything other than that. There's a lot of people that actually don't realise that there's anything more to yoga than just busting out some fancy shapes on your mat. And that's the way, say, the modern yoga world has unfolded. At the same time, there's also, as I said, a lot less teachers who understand the practice, because in this day and age you can go to used to be able to go to a tropical island for a month, hang out with someone who had done their teacher training 6 months ago, spend a month with them, reading from a textbook, 5 hours a day, and then getting drunk at night, and then a month later you'd sent off into the world and with a certificate saying you're now a yoga teacher. And that's a very far cry from a teacher from a student who dedicates many, many years to living with and studying under a teacher before they're then allowed to share the practices themselves, or given permission to share the practices themselves. And a guru is, I guess, as Krishnananda alluded to, there have always been, because of human nature, gurus who have not held to the principles of yoga, who've abused their students physically, mentally, emotionally, sexually. And that is a great tragedy, but that doesn't mean that all teachers are like that. It's just a bit harder, perhaps, in our modern day and age to find, because there's that old saying that power corrupts, and in our modern world, as the number of students attracted to a teacher has increased, the sense of power perhaps that a teacher can feel that they have increases, and of course as the power increases, the tendency for corruption of that power increases. And I guess that's where in the old days, when you had a teacher sitting in their ashram with half a dozen or a dozen students, there was no great sense of power that the teacher had then. It's not like now where you can have, someone teaching an asana class to hundreds of people, or giving a satsang or a discourse to hundreds, if not thousands of people. And of course, in the world of social media, there's a lot of people with, hundreds of thousands or millions of followers that, will be influenced by what the person they follow says. And so there is that potential for teachers of all levels, even those who have best intentions, to be corrupted if they're not very, very careful. And just as a student, it's important that we maintain constant vigilance in our practice as a teacher. It's equally important to not get complacent and think that, once there's a certain level of understanding, that you can just, become lazy and not have to worry about keeping an eye on the ego, on the way the ahamkara moves to try and distort and pervert all the positive aspects of this existence and turn them into something negative. And so one of the things that I believe is really important is that we start, if we're genuine in our practice of yoga, that we start to try to go back more towards that old way of sharing the practices. So we're not just flitting from one teacher to another, just picking up, little bits and pieces, little snippets, but we actually try to find a teacher that resonates with us. And it doesn't matter who that is, as long as they're a genuine teacher. Someone who understands that yoga is a spiritual practice, fundamentally, not a religious practice, but a spiritual one. And that once we find the teacher that resonates with us, that we stay with them and study from them and learn from them. And there's two simple analogies, I guess, that I've heard over the last few years that perhaps outline the importance of that. And one was, I read somewhere, I can't remember where it was, but a teacher was saying that, it might have been Muji, was saying that if you want to dig a well, you pick a spot and then you just dig one hole really deeply until you strike water. If you dig 50 shallow holes, you're not actually going to get anywhere. And some years ago, I was just did a workshop with a teacher named Annie Carpenter, and she was asking some of the people in the workshop who their teacher was, and she asked 2 or 3 people, and then she asked this other person, and he said, this and this and this, and she said, no. Yoga is like, the relationship you have with your teacher is like you have with your partner. If you're just moving from one to another, it'll never go very deep. And I think that's, the longer I teach that, the more that resonates with me from the teacher's perspective. Because when we stay practicing with one teacher, and when I find students staying with me for a longer period of time, we get to know each other quite well. And there's a level of trust and a level of honesty that's built up over that time, as there is with any relationship. And there's a level of insight, perhaps that, as the more, I guess, the more experienced I get with teaching, the more I perhaps start to recognise the things that I've seen within myself in other people, and often they might be mental patterns that the person isn't aware of themselves, but because I've seen them within my own body and mind, I can recognise them in other people as well. And that perhaps gives me a way to help other people to see for themselves where perhaps there's mental patterns that aren't serving them. And it's not my job to browbeat people and tell them what to do, but certainly as a teacher, it's our role to pass on the knowledge that we've learned and the understandings that we've learned, so that ideally we all grow and learn from the experiences of those that have come before us. And that's what happens when we read old yoga texts, or when we study with an experienced teacher. We're taking the knowledge that has been learnt over the thousands of years that yoga has been practiced, and we're building upon that knowledge. So hopefully we're not all having to go back to square one and spend 24 hours a day living in our cave or in our little ashram in the jungle or living on our deserted island in order to have some insight into the nature of who and what we are. Because of course most of us live in our modern world, and we're not going to, as much as it might seem appealing sometimes, we're not going to lock ourselves away in a cave and meditate 24/7. But if we learn from those who've come before us, we perhaps don't need to do that. We can instead take their insights and apply them within the activities of our normal day-to-day life. And so I think it's really important that we understand that the guru-disciple or teacher-student relationship is something that is very, very important, particularly in the early stages of our practice, or let's say early and middle stages of our practice. It helps us to avoid pitfalls. If we have a good connection with a genuine teacher, it helps to sort of fast track our practice a little bit, we could say, or fast track our understanding a little bit. And from the teacher's perspective, the sharing of understanding of yoga should be done without any onerous expectation from the student, without any great demands placed upon them. So I think the first thing that should set off alarm bells is teachers who say, sign up your life savings to me and then I'll give you the mantra to enlightenment. Or people who make very heavy demands on your time or other resources. Because ultimately, if we have a deep insight into the understanding of who and what we are through our yoga practice, we realise that we actually don't need very much. So if we find a teacher who is caught up in wanting stuff, or wanting fame, or wanting a huge group of Sangha, a huge body of students, then it should be really setting off little alarm bells that perhaps this person's not right for us. Of course, in the modern world, with myself as a yoga teacher, there's a paradox that in order for me to be able to share the practices with you, I do need to pay my mortgage and pay for the rent of the shala. So I do need to ask something from you. But there should always be, I believe, in the teacher-student relationship, there should be at least as much give from the teacher as there is give from the students. So there's a desire to share. Because of course we recognise within ourselves that the practices of yoga have brought us to a place of greater peace, greater self-content, a deeper sense of ease as we move through the challenges of life. And we wish, through the recognition that we're all fundamentally the same, that we share the same consciousness, we wish to share those practices with everyone around us so that they too can move through this life with a sense of greater ease and greater peace, to be more comfortable with whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, and to be able to express the love that is our true nature. And that all happens relatively spontaneously, simply because it's the nature of, if you're called to teach, if you're genuinely called to teach, you wish to share. To remove, as the definition says, to help others remove their own veil of darkness, or to remove the burdens that we place upon ourselves. Not consciously, not intentionally, but simply through the nature of the way the mind moves. To always focus on the negative and the contracting tendencies of who and what we are. So that's maybe, I don't know if that answers your question. Again, I guess it's a pretty broad one.
I agree with 100% of it. Yeah, I think it's great. Yeah. A lot of it ran for me. I know when I first was introduced to my guru, it was like, kidding me, aren't you? I'm not going to go with that guru. And that was honest, you know, and she never pushed it on me.
Yeah.
No, she never pushed it on me ever. Oh, you know, maybe 12 months later when she asked me if I would like to be her disciple.
Yeah.
But by that time it was a longing. It was like, I didn't know it was a longing, you know, but it was a longing inside of me. But yeah, I think the easiest way is just, what's that saying? When the student is ready, the teacher will appear.
I was going to say exactly that.
Yeah, it's an old saying, but it's so true.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't going there for a teacher or a guru.
Yeah.
I just went there for the music. Seriously, it's serious, and it was bhakti.
Look, we all find our teachers
exactly, you know,
through various means.
Why do you do yoga? Does body do yoga still?
Absolutely, it does. It just doesn't do a lot of asana.
Right? But I didn't know that. I didn't know how many limbs or how many whatever parts of yoga there are.
And none of that matters.
And none of it matters. I found that out too. So then when I started going into the psychological spiritual side of it, I just went, whoa, how did this stuff? You know, and that's, so to me that's the killer.
Yeah.
Kills the mind, you know, that's what the teacher does for me.
Yeah.
The teacher just points, and you don't have to go. And I suppose I don't say I'm at a stage, but my guru says, that's what she says to me, and then I hear it in other gurus. I'm not the guru, you're the guru.
Yeah.
The guru's actually inside you, I'm just pointing you around.
Yeah. And that's actually the next thing I was going to say, because I mentioned it a few minutes ago when I said particular teacher is important in the beginning and middle stages of our practice.
Totally.
Because ultimately what yoga teaches us, both if we read formal texts and if we dig into the practice ourselves, we understand that ultimately there is the inner guru. So the outer guru is perhaps the one that helps us overcome the bigger obstacles in the initial parts of our practice. But as we deepen our understanding, we realise that we actually all have that inner guru. So the understanding within our own hearts of right action, of right knowledge, and of the path back to our true self. But we often need to strip away some of the noisy distractions in the outset in order to recognise that inner guru. And you know, as those of you who've been here before know, I don't speak purely from a traditional yoga or Hindu perspective in these talks. I try to draw from all spiritual practices, and there's one verse in the Bible that has always struck a chord with me, even more so once I started practicing yoga, and it simply says God spoke in a still small voice. And in yoga the same thing is said in many other different ways, but essentially what it's saying is that inner guru, however we want to interpret it, is a very, very quiet voice within us. And if our mind is very loud, if there's a lot of inner chatter, if there's a lot of distracting tendency in our mind and heart, then there's just too much noise to hear that quiet voice underneath. And I mentioned something, because we share our love of music, I mentioned something a few weeks ago, that in music we there's this, or let's say in psychoacoustics, there's this understanding of what's called masking. And it means that when you've got two sounds at the same frequency, our ears generally only hear the loudest one. So if Sue, probably a bad example to say, if Sue and I speak and our voices are the same pitch, because they're not quite the same pitch, But if they were, and we were to make the same sound, if we were to say the same thing, and she was louder than me, you wouldn't hear my voice at all, you'd just hear hers. And that's a really simple analogy for what happens within our mind and heart when there's a lot of noise, of loud thoughts, of loud distracting, dialogue in the mind. Then it masks the quiet voice underneath, the voice of truth, or the voice of, God, or of the Guru, or of the divine, or however you want to interpret it. These are all just words, and they really don't mean anything more or less than anything else. So how you want to interpret that is entirely up to you. But it is very much a case, I believe, that, and Nisargadatta Maharaj said this very clearly once. He said that the only guru that will see you to the very end of the practice is the guru within. So our outer guru gives us a good shove, helps us along the way, gives us pointers in the right direction, but actually the only teacher that takes us to the very end of the path is the teacher within. And so it's really important that we develop in the initial stages of our practice a connection to an outer teacher, but ultimately to allow that outer teacher to help us to see the teacher within, and then to recognise that we ultimately only need to listen to that quiet voice within our heart that actually speaks in silence. There's when the inner guru speaks, when we have right knowing within our heart, there's no inner dialogue, there's no thought, there's simply a knowing in silence of what needs to be done or not be done. And it's in silence only that we hear that voice within, that inner teacher. And that's why it's important that we learn to quieten the mind, so that we can start to hear that voice within. Or actually to hear the silence within. Because it is, as I said, only in silence that the truth is spoken. Which may not make any sense at all to many of you at this point in time, and for some of you I know it does. It seems paradoxical to say that the truth is spoken in silence. But it is true. It's actually the truth is known in silence.
Well, Steve, life for me is the greatest teacher. If you approach it with awareness and curiosity.
Yeah, it's certainly life, the manifest life, everything in the manifest world is duality. That is the nature of the embodied existence, or the physical world in which we live. I firmly believe there is no more good than bad, there is no more bad than good. It is a balance of light and dark. And that's expressed again in lots of spiritual traditions, more so in the East, but also in some Western traditions as well. And I think the detail of what you said is the most important part. Life can be a wonderful teacher if we approach it with awareness, because it's very easy for life to not teach us anything at all. And there's, the vast majority of the world around us will learn, as far as the human population goes, will learn precious little about themselves between the moment of birth and the moment of death. And it's only if we are alert and aware that we have the opportunity to learn. And it's not about learning about other things. Ultimately, what we need to learn about is ourselves, to understand who and what we are. And I've said before that really the practice of yoga is simply a scientific way of answering the question of who am I? On a fundamental level, who am I? This is my body, this is my mind, but who is the me that has them? And on a very simplistic, fundamental level, that is what the yoga practice is. It's a series of tools to help us answer that question. And of course, life is, again, a wonderful way for us to find out who we are if we approach it with alertness. But the nature of life in its duality is that it's very difficult, unless we're given some pointers, it's very difficult for us to interpret those flip sides of duality of good and bad and understanding that they're actually just mental constructs. And there is no fundamentally good experience or bad experience. There is only how we interpret it. Our entire life is a construct in our mind. But until we understand that, then we don't approach life with awareness. Or let's say it's very rare that we do. The more we're connected to nature and to a natural way of living, the more we tend to have an inherent understanding of the nature of existence. But again, in our busy modern life, most of us are quite well removed from a natural way of living. So it becomes more and more important for us to have these tools to help us steady the mind and see within to find out who we are. Does that make sense? I guess to some extent it brings us back to the importance of a teacher of the good.
Steve, something that I don't know if I quite understand, it's sort of related to this, is about do we shape our own destiny? As you talked about us being puppets on a screen or something. It's I find it a bit hard to relate to. I feel it kind of, I guess if you're sort of connecting to your inner guru, then you're kind of going in one direction, and if you weren't, you might be going in a different direction. Is that all pre-decided, or how does yoga philosophy?
It really depends. It's a really good question, and it's not one there's an easy answer to. And I would say that ultimately it doesn't actually matter that much, but I'll give you perhaps some ideas around it. So in some yoga traditions they say that there is absolutely no free will, that everything is preordained, and no matter what you do, this is what's going to happen, that every moment of your life from birth to death is mapped out, and nothing you can do can change any of it. And there are other yoga traditions that say we have volition, let's say, or self-will, and we can direct our choices and direct the path of our life. So some traditions very much say no free will, others say total free will. There's one text that says both within a couple of sentences. It actually says there's nothing to do, everything is preordained, but self-effort is essential for self-realisation. And of course you can interpret that as saying perhaps in some people the self-will is preordained. That might be one way to interpret it. I think there's a couple of ways we can think of it. I would say one way to interpret the contradiction of free will versus predestination would be to say that we should act as if we have free will, knowing that that may not be the case. So we do make choices, we do make decisions, and it's okay perhaps if it helps us to act as if we have free will. Ultimately, whether we do or not remains unknown, right? We don't know whether we were always destined to make that decision. But we still act with free will. We don't just become, blobs sitting on the lounge waiting for everything to happen. And I've mentioned in past in Satsang that little funny story. I think it's a funny story of the guy who's a devout Christian who's in his house when it's flooding, and the flood waters are up to his knees, and a little guy comes along in a tinny and says, "Hey man, it's flooding. Do you want me to give you a lift out of here to safety?" And he goes, "No, it's okay. God's going to look after me. God's going to save me." And then he stays there. The guy in the tinny goes off, and then the water level gets a bit higher, and the guy's standing on his furniture, and the police boat comes along and says, or the SAS come along and say, "Hey, the water level's still rising. You're in really grave danger. Jump in the boat and we'll take you to safety." And the guy says, "No, God's going to save me. I'm just going to sit here. It's all going to be fine." And the water level keeps rising. He gets on his roof, and a helicopter comes over and says, "We'll winch you to safety." And he says, No, it's all good. I'm just going to wait here. God's going to save me." And the helicopter flies off. The water level rises. The guy drowns, and he goes to heaven. And he says, God, I was devout, I trusted you my whole life. You know, I thought you were going to save me. And God says, what do you mean? I sent you 2 boats and a helicopter. You know, that's where we can fall into that trap of complacency of thinking if everything's predestined or preordained, then we don't have to do anything. We still have to act. So we still have to make decisions. But whether or not we have free choice is irrelevant.
Steve, I guess it's about being attached to an outcome of whatever we choose to do. You know, we have a desire to act and we take that action, but it's then not being attached to an outcome. So it's how we respond to whatever happens that
Yes.
is ultimately, I mean, it really doesn't matter what happens in life, but
No.
it's really our response to it that creates our reality around it.
Well, it's our response to it that ties us back into the ahamkara, to the
Yes.
personality. So just for those who haven't been here before, in yoga, the word for the sense of individuality, of being a little thing, and this is what in Western spirituality we would often interpret as the soul. The word is ahamkara, and it means sense of individuality, and a good way to think of it, or the word, I often think of it as the construct of the ego and the mind, the body and the mind. So it's not ego in the way, so we sometimes use the word ego because it's a lot shorter than ahamkara, but it's not the ego in the Western sense or psychological sense. It means the sense of me as an individual, as a body and mind that's separate from everything else. And Sue's absolutely right, and you know we mentioned this in the past that, and again the Bhagavad Gita probably puts this the most succinctly, where it talks about we have the right to action but not the results of our action. And so it's when there's nothing wrong with making decisions, because of course throughout life we are constantly presented with decisions. What am I going to have for breakfast? You know, which way will I drive to work today? You know, will I say this or that to that person that I met on the street or at work? In the nature of the manifest world, we are constantly having to make decisions. And it's not the act of making a decision that is a problem, it's when we are attached to a specific outcome as a result of it. And so what the Bhagavad Gita says is we control our own actions, but not the results of them. And again, we could also look at this as another way of interpreting free will versus predestination. We might have free will over what we do, but everything else might be predestined. And so, you know, I guess what I'm trying to say is it doesn't actually matter that much. We still have to act. The important thing, as Sue mentioned, is that we act without attachment to results. And that's a really...
The Bible sort of says that, it just comes to mind a couple of verses in the Bible, I probably won't get them really accurately, but one says, ask and it is given. So that's about just having that desire, but it's already there. But then you have to. Then another verse says, knock and the door will open. You've got to take action. So you know, it's having that desire, then taking action.
Yeah, look, I think that's one way that's certainly one way you could say it. There is that text is 3 specific verses. It's ask and you shall receive, seek and you shall find, knock and the door will be opened unto you. And it's actually not talking about our desires in the physical world. It's very specifically talking about self-realization, really, about understanding the nature of the self or reuniting with God or the divine or the universe or whatever you want to say. And it's actually what it's very clearly saying is that, and the yoga tradition talks about this as well, that there is no one who cannot reconnect with the nature of their true self, who cannot reconnect with the divine and recognise that they always were simply the divine spark moving through a human body. It's saying that we don't have to have specific techniques, we don't have to use specific language, we don't have to know the secret knock. We just have to ask with all our heart to have our one true desire to be to rediscover the nature of who and what we are, and we will ultimately be granted that union with our true self, which is the universal self. I don't think that verse is intended in the way you perhaps were saying it then, but I don't think it takes away from that.
There's probably many layers to that. There's many layers to that.
I think there are. I think it's also really important that we recognise very clearly from a yoga tradition, Ashtavakra Gita puts it very clearly where it says desire and aversion are of the mind and the mind is never yours. Once you recognise this, you're free. And so what we need to recognise is that most of the time when we make decisions, we're attached to an outcome of wanting to get something or wanting to avoid something. And that nature of action with a desire for outcome is the mind, is the ahamkara. And ultimately, the person who is relatively disconnected from the ahamkara and relatively connected to their deeper self has very few desires. Or let's say they might have, let's say desires that express their personality or their individuality, because we're all individual expressions of the same consciousness, but there's no great attachment to them. So it's okay to want to have, some comforts. We don't all have to live, under a tarpaulin. It's okay to have a comfortable house. But if we have a comfortable house and we're not happy with it, then we've got to look at why we're not happy with it. And it's because we're attached to the desires of the ahamkara. And ultimately, as we get more and more disconnected from the ahamkara, we don't kill it, we don't get rid of it altogether, because it's the mechanism through which we experience the world and through which the body moves through the world. But as we associate ourselves with it less, we find that our desires become less and less and less, and we actually don't really care too much. Like, yeah, it'd be nice to get a new bike, but if I get it next month, that's great, and if I have to get it 6 months' time, that's great, and if it's in 2 years' time, that's fine. It's not a big deal. We're not hanging all our hopes on, an idea that we want or an outcome of a desire or an action. And so that's one of the things that I really think is for me, is very important to understand, that our desires and our aversions, our wants and our don't wants, our likes and our dislikes, are simply in the mind. And if they're harmless desires, there's nothing wrong with having them. But as soon as they start to create a sense of discontent when we don't have them, then we need to be very, very alert and recognise that that is something that the ahamkara is using to try and pull us back in to association with it. And that's what I think we need to, I sort of touched on this a moment ago. We don't try to get rid of the ahamkara, we just simply disassociate from it. It becomes, it's a bit like we're the driver in the car and the ahamkara is the car. Or let's say a better way might be to say that the body is the car, the ahamkara is the steering wheel and the pedals and the gear shift, and we're the driver. It's a simple analogy, but perhaps that's one way to understand it. The self is, in the car. The ahamkara is the mechanism through which the car is steered, navigated through life, and the body is the vehicle that carries us along. So that might be one way to think of it.
I think, Steve, just on that, that ties in for me with free will, because I was thinking, if I truly had free will, I would choose not to get upset when I'm being triggered by that, or not to be upset by my perceived slight by that person.
Yeah.
And of course, I am constantly being triggered. Yeah. So do I have free will? I think the only way I can truly have free will is if I disassociate from the power of the ego.
Yeah.
And that's the only way I'll truly have it, because those circumstances can still occur.
Yeah.
But I've got the free will whether to react or not.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point, and it sort of ties in with something else I was going to say about the question of free will. We've talked about it from a few different perspectives, but what we haven't done, and which you just sort of touched on there, is who is it that has free will and wants it? So, whilst ever, and I guess the simple way to put this would be to say, whilst ever we are associating ourself, the sense of me as being part of the ahamkara, or the ahamkara being the source of me, then this idea of free will comes up. Once we disassociate from the ahamkara, once we recognise we're not it, not only can we say we have free will because we don't respond, let's say we're not compelled to respond in a certain way to our external circumstances or to the circumstances of life. In the absolute consciousness that is our true nature, there's no one to even ask free will or to do anything or want anything. There's not even the idea of a question of free will and of action. And that, for some of you, that probably makes no sense, and maybe I'm not saying it in the clearest way. But from my own understanding, through years and years of the practice, when we reach, or in times of deep connection to the self, we recognise that we actually want nothing at all. That we are absolutely complete, whole and perfect right here and right now, regardless of what's going on around us. In the midst of a complete shitstorm, you just there go, I'm absolutely, completely content and perfect, and nothing can take that away. And so, free will, what's free will? What's action? There's nothing. Nothing other than the perfection of simply being in the silence of the self. Aware of everything, but with no attachment to any of it, because it's all unreal. It's all simply an illusion in the mind. As I mentioned, our whole life is a mental construct based on our upbringing and our mental predisposition. And once we're free of that mental construct, and once we realise it is simply a mental construct, then what actions need to be taken? Again, Nisargadatta puts it very clearly when he says, once you understand the practice of yoga, you realise that the waking state and the dream state are no different. They are both plays in consciousness, and they are fundamentally the same. And so it doesn't matter what happens in our dreams, we recognise that. And ultimately, once we reach a deeper level of understanding, it doesn't really matter what happens in our day-to-day life, because it's equally unreal. It's equally imaginary. And that's something...
Sorry.
That's okay.
I was going to say, I think sometimes you need to be careful when you speak like, I think I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
But it can come across a bit automatic, or like an automaton, or like a robot.
Yeah.
I mean, the truth is, of course nothing matters, but it doesn't mean that you won't experience and feel it.
That's right.
And the importance is, though, that you don't put the attachment to the experience.
That's right.
Or whatever's going on, because we are human.
Yeah.
And
well, let's say we're living through a human.
well, like my favourite thing is, you're here because life wants to experience yourself.
That's exactly right.
And that resonates so strongly with me.
Yeah.
And the trouble starts when you start getting too attached to the experiences, and then the mental disruption and the upset because this didn't happen, that didn't happen, that did happen.
It's when we start to think that I'll be happy when,
Yeah.
or I'll be content when, or I will feel loved when, rather than recognising that happiness and contentment and love are our inherent nature. When everything else drops away, that is what remains. But simply through the nature of being born into a body, we start to associate circumstances, experience, actions, people with the source of our contentment, happiness, joy, whatever else you want to say. And so that's not, I guess that's, what we want to always recognise, that those, and my teacher says it all the time, these experiences in life simply spark what is already within us. They remind us of our inherent nature. And negative experiences remind us of how far or how much we've forgotten our true nature, how much of an illusory barrier we've put up between what we are and what we think we are. So yeah, we're not trying to become blank. We should be able to, with deep clarity, we should be able to experience life fully, to experience all of its ups and downs, all of its duality, but also knowing that ultimately none of it will affect our fundamental nature. And that's actually what allows us to experience life more fully, because we know that no matter how good things are, it doesn't change, and no matter how bad things are, it doesn't change. So we can go into, deep sadness when, something tragic happens, knowing that we're not going to stay stuck in that deep sadness, because our true nature is light and joy and love. And we can go into the most uplifting of experiences and go into them fully, knowing that when that experience passes, which it inevitably will, because all things come and go, knowing that our fundamental nature was still joy and love and peace. Whereas normally when we associate with the ego, we don't go fully into our experiences. We tend to hold back a little bit. We're worried about being too sad, expressing our grief fully, or our frustration fully, or our anger fully. And we're afraid of expressing our joy and our happiness fully. We always hold a little bit back because we're worried about what happens when it's gone, or what happens, if it's something positive, what happens when it's gone, and if it's something bad, what happens if it stays. Whereas once we recognise over time that our fundamental nature remains changeless despite the circumstances of life, then we can experience life fully. Or let's say more fully.
Steve, could you talk about this in a social justice context? Like, we're very privileged in this room.
Yeah.
There are people who live with violence and suffering on a daily basis who are obviously a very long way from this. But also, if you work in a social justice frame, it's hard not to be attached to the outcomes of your actions. That's what you're trying to achieve something.
Yeah, and I guess it's a really difficult one, because there are some things in life where, particularly when we're doing something, I guess, for the benefit of someone else, when we desperately hope for a positive outcome, but there's actually no guarantee it's going to happen. And I think, in a social in that context, I guess the attachment to an outcome is probably what leads a lot of people in those fields to burnout, because they are constantly trying to elicit change. And I'm not saying this is always the case, but particularly in situations of people who are exposed to habitual violence, it's often because, for, let's say, the person who is the victim of the violence, often through their own upbringing, has come to the point where they think that's what they deserve. And that's, of course, a great tragedy. And someone trying to help them out of that situation might be doing everything they can to help them to realise that they are worth more and they don't need to keep putting themselves back into that harmful situation. But ultimately, they can't make that person change. And it's the same with what we were talking about with the guru-disciple relationship, teacher-student relationship. I can give you the pointers of things that I've learned through the practice, but if you don't implement them yourself, nothing's going to change. And so again, in a yoga perspective, there's a lot of people who, again, through a lack of perhaps deep understanding and, let's say, grounding in their own practice, get frustrated and disenchanted and disheartened with being a yoga teacher because they're thinking, yoga's wonderful, I'm going to share it with other people and they're all going to see how wonderful it is. And then it doesn't happen and they become disheartened and they give up. In the same way, as you say, in the social justice context, the trap for those trying to help others is to think that because you have a good intention and have appropriate training in helping to share methodology for change, that person is going to instigate the change. And so it brings us back again to the understanding that we can control our own actions, and with concerted effort there is a greater probability that there will be a certain outcome, but ultimately there's no guarantee. And it's really difficult because the nature of all of us is to connect with each other, because fundamentally we are actually all the same consciousness. Once we strip away the ahamkara, the mind with all its self-imposed limitations and ideas of what we are and what we're not, the pure consciousness within us is absolutely the same in every single one of us. And it's that sense of recognition of our oneness that leads us to want to help others on all levels. Whether it's just, holding the door open for someone who's got their hands full of shopping bags, or whether it's helping someone out of a difficult situation that they're in their family or work life. It's that sense of connection that wants us to help others and to uplift others, to remove suffering. But we need to recognise that there are limitations to what we can do. We need to recognise that we really do only control our own actions. And if we wish to help others, we need to recognise with full humility, not with laziness, but with humility, that we can do everything within our power, but then we just have to step back and let the person that we're talking to or the person that we're helping do or not do of their own volition. And that is what allows us to continue to try and uplift others. Because there's, as a yoga teacher, one of the things I've learned over the years is that no matter what I do, what I try and share, some people will not follow a path of self-inquiry, of wanting to understand the nature of the self. And and there have been times, not so much recently, but in the early days of my teaching, where I would get really disheartened when things didn't work out, when you're trying desperately to help someone out of a situation, whether it's as simple as trying to help them break down a physical pattern in their body, or you're trying to help them out of a negative mental pattern that they're in. And when it doesn't happen, it's really easy to get disheartened. And if I'd stopped teaching 10 years ago, which could have happened, then I wouldn't have been able to share these teachings and these practices with everyone that's come along since then. And so we need to understand, I guess, that there is a limitation to what we can do, and if we get attached, again, despite the best of intentions, if we get attached to thinking we can elicit a specific outcome with certainty, then we're going to end up causing harm to ourselves and probably harm to others as well.
What about if it's not an individual thing? Like, what about, getting into a more of a political realm, but, say that you see an injustice in a certain country, of racial inequality, people are trying to move together to make a change. I know individually we can make changes, but when, I know that there's the people that, that they're going against are so, completely lost in the mind, lost in money, lost in power, lost in everything. But there is that sense of frustration. Sometimes you just get really frustrated and you say, fuck, you know, like why can't things be fair for these people? Why can't everyone live equally? Why does there have to be this inequality? Why do people have to get shot because of the colour of their skin? You know what I mean? You can get kind of caught up in what the world is going through, and it's just like, is that just karma? Is that just the world playing itself out?
It's certainly, sorry,
I'm finished.
I think there's, that could be, there's probably lots of different questions in there and they could all be answered in different ways. I think regardless of the context, again, I think it's important to recognise that, Australia is fucked up, but it's not as fucked up as some other places in the world. So in that sense, we are very privileged, in our society, and most of us, because of the
Unless you're Indigenous.
Yeah, I was going to say most of us, the colour of our skin gives us an advantage in our society. For some of us, our gender gives us an advantage in our society, and we should always be moving towards resolving inequality and injustice. But again, we need to recognise that some things are out of our hands. So that doesn't mean we go, oh fuck it, we'll just leave it alone. Sorry for swearing, a bit of a potty now. That doesn't mean we go, I'm not going to do anything. Again, we don't just sit back on and say, no, it's okay, I'm not going to jump in the boat, God's coming to save me, God will fix the world. We do actually need to get off our butts and act if we see an injustice that we are called to rail against, to try and resolve. But we also need to be aware that, as I said, the world is one of duality, that there will always be in the world positive and negative, good and bad, light and dark, and that is the nature of this world, and that is not a bad thing, because as our teacher says regularly, the greatest challenges provide the greatest seeds for transformation. If life is very, very comfortable, we're not called to inquire into the nature of the self, or we're less likely, because the ahamkara has been placated, it's happy, it's got what it wants. The challenges in life are there to help us to recognise that there is something more, to recognise that those challenging situations are the impetus for us to seek for our deeper self, to seek contentment and peace and justice within our own heart. And so that doesn't mean, as I say, that we become complacent, but we recognise that the challenges in life are there to drive us to something better. And there's a book that I haven't read, but I read a quote from it a few years ago, and it starts. It's a management, actually a management kind of book, but it starts off with the line, "Good is the enemy of great," and that's an interesting thought to bear in mind. If life is good, it stops us from searching for a life that's great. The closer it is to contentment, the more it takes us away from seeking true contentment. Does that make sense? And I guess another example is there's that expression when you don't know what sort of juice is in someone until you give them a squeeze. And I'm sure you can all relate to people who are really, really lovely, happy people when everything goes their way. And as soon as something doesn't go their way, suddenly they turn. Yeah?
You don't know anyone like that, Steve.
Neither do you.
And Steve, the world is really just a reflection of what's inside of all of us. We can point and say and be very judgmental about what all of the injustices, but that injustice actually is in all of us. We all have the dark and the
Absolutely.
light. So it's just a reflection of us. So it always comes back to how am I contributing to this?
Yeah, to our own actions.
Yeah.
To what I do about it. As
You have to clean up your own work.
Yeah. It's, again, from the Christian context, there's a little verse about pull a log out of your own eye before you try and pull a splinter out of someone else's.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one which I think it's hilarious, but from Ramana, where he said the greatest service you can offer to humanity is to seek for your own self-realisation. Otherwise, it's a bit like trying to cover the whole world with leather to avoid getting thorns in your feet. It's just much easier to put on sandals. And that's the visuals I think of that are hilarious. But it's a reminder that we need to deal with our own actions first. And if we can sort our actions because we're starting to clear our own heart and mind, then there is a flow-on effect, unconsciously usually, that affects everyone around us. And we, as you say, Sue, we are, as we were talking about before, every single one of us is a part of the duality of the phenomenal world. We all have the potential to move towards our true self, towards peace and love and harmony and kindness and goodness and contentment and compassion and forgiveness. And we all have the potential to do the exact opposite. And it's the association with the ahamkara, with me as an individual, that pulls us into those damaging, dangerous, dark places. And it's as we step more and more away from the sense of individuality that we start to connect more and more with the sense of oneness on a physical level and on a deeper spiritual level. And that's why I think, Ramana said, the greatest service you can offer is to seek your own self-realisation. Because by simply doing that, you are moving away from darkness into light. There's that word guru, the remover of darkness.
Is that not to say, to not neglect the darkness, as in a way, almost integrating, accepting
absolutely.
it as well, without burying it and forgetting about it,
Yeah.
because it is a part of your wholeness?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But we can't really remove,
You can't remove any of that.
because if you turn off the light, we're in darkness, but it's only it's only the light that there can be darkness.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I do know what you're saying. I think, again...
It's shining the light into the dark.
Well, this is the nature of duality. This is what we're saying. In the oneness of the self, there's no light and dark.
No.
There is just...
Light.
It's not even light, it's just everything.
Yeah.
There's nothing to compare anything to. So as you say, we need light to show darkness, we need darkness to show light. But when there's nothing, or when everything is the same, might be another way to say it. What's light and dark? What's good and bad? Without, the nature of duality is that we draw comparison and we say this is better than this, or worse than this, and that's what sets us up in our pattern of good and bad and like and dislike.
It's the judgment.
It's the judgment. And so, again, I've mentioned this many times to you in the past, we all have, and it ties into what we've been saying, we all have that potential for light and dark. We all have the quiet voice urging us back home to oneness, and we all have what in the psychology world is called the saboteur, the negative voice, we would say the ahamkara, or the voice of the ahamkara in the yoga tradition, that is taking us into that negativity, into those dark places, into that sense of contraction, me, individuality. And we can't stop either of those things from happening. The quiet voice is always there, and the voice of the ahamkara is always there. All we do is simply choose to ignore what we don't need. So when those negative thought, we use the word negative in this context, When negative thoughts are there, we don't try and stop them. We simply ignore them or learn to ignore them so that they're still there, but we're just not paying them any attention. So we're still fully aware that that potential for, the dark within us is there, but we choose not to pay attention to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, without ignoring, because it has to go somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Well, what happens is when you ignore it enough, it just goes away, it subsides, it loses energy, and it just subsides of its
So
own.
as long as there's light, it's going to be there, right? Being the duality of it.
Sure, but the more we, and this is what I was saying, the more we disconnect from associating with duality,
Yeah.
the more that momentum of light and dark.
Oh, we're acting out of light, but that's, I don't know if I'm putting it right, because the ahankara,
Yeah.
just doing say, Carl Jung with the shadow work, would you liken the two together, just in a different...
Look, I haven't read much. You would also, I wouldn't like to comment on it. I do think they're different.
Yep. They just seem to have a lot of negative similarities with...
There's definitely similarities,
Yeah.
and interestingly, Jung wrote the prefaces to a few modern yoga treatises, but he, as all psychologists do, they stop at the most important bit. They draw the barrier at recognising that there's something we are which is not the person. So that's where I think when we start to use the language of psychology, it can get a bit confusing, because the nature in the yoga tradition and in any spiritual tradition, there is a fundamental understanding that I am not the body and the mind. I am something that is beyond the limitations of this.
Yeah, which is why I don't want to use psychology, but Jung is the guy that connected the spirituality with, from my understanding anyway, and it's very feeble at this stage, but I'm just trying to get my head around this introduction to the ahankara.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess it's things to bear in mind, and most of you have heard me say this before. Ultimately, what we're talking about is things that you can't understand with the mind, because the mind exists within them. And so we can have a certain level of intellectual understanding of the practices and the theory and the purpose of any spiritual practice, but ultimately until you taste it for yourself, it's just an intellectual understanding. And the analogy I've given many times before is you can tell someone what a mango tastes like till the cows come home, but until they taste it, they're not going to know. You can say it's a bit like this and it's a bit like that, and that might give them an idea. They might eat a potato and go, well, that's definitely not a mango. But until they actually taste the mango, they're not going to know. And so that's not to say that we shouldn't try and have a degree of understanding of the practice and the purpose and the understanding, but it's really important, and I speak from my own experience, if you try and think your way out of your mind, you're in a feedback loop. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
So a degree of understanding is I think beneficial to a point, but ultimately if we try and just pursue that pathway, we come up against an impassable stumbling block. And we actually have to recognise what exists when there is no mind and no thought. And to truly recognise it. And I talk about this, we talk about this all the time at the end of yoga class. We talk about, in Shavasana, I talk about watching your breath and watching the silence between breaths. And sometimes I talk about watching the silence between thoughts. And that brief instant, it's called, fleeting Samadhi in a lot of the yoga texts. Those brief instants between thoughts, which are analogous to the moments between breaths, are the little windows into the nature of the self. When we recognise that the mind, which is simply the movement of thought, has ceased to exist, and yet I remain. So what is it that I am if I'm not the mind and the body? And so can you see what I mean? How if you're trying to think your way into it, you're stuck in that voice in your head.
Yeah, I wasn't going into thought though. I was just trying to find a similarity between them so I could understand it a bit better.
Sure.
And is it this description of darkness? Because I'm confused with the duality of it. If we're do we live side by side with this thing?
Yeah, I would say. Well,
that's what I mean. Like it's always going to be there. I would not say you have to act on it.
Yeah.
But to recognise.
Yeah.
And
I would say we don't live. I think we're certainly recognising that it's always there. But I'd say we're side by side would be one way to think of it. But I think that that again takes us to a flawed understanding of our true nature. I would, and I mentioned this very briefly a moment ago, or a few minutes ago, when I said everything is, our mind is actually within consciousness. So and our whole world is a mental construct within consciousness. And so the light and the dark, which is expressed in our thoughts, which is expressed in our body, which is expressed in the world around us, all of that actually exists not side by side with consciousness, but within consciousness. Just like a dream exists within the dreamer. It has no, it's not to say the dream doesn't exist in some level within the dreamer, but it's not. It's the dream, not the dreamer, if that makes sense. In the same way, a whole world exists within consciousness. The light and the dark of it is there, the action of it is there, the body is there, but it's ultimately not who we are or what we are, and we're not limited by it. And when we wake up from the dream, the dreamer is still there. When we wake up from the dream of thinking we're the mind, or the ahamkara, then we're still there.
How I see it, how I sort of come to see it in my own mind, is that pure consciousness, which is the light, is like this screen. And overlaid on that screen are our thoughts, our personalities, all of those parts of us, that sometimes it can actually cover, well, most of the time, it covers the screen.
Yeah, and that analogy is given a lot in sort of the semi-modern yoga texts. They either talk about a screen or a mirror. One of the analogy of the mirror is very common, and Rama also uses one of the screen, and it talks about, instead of seeing the mirror, let's use the mirror analogy. The screen one is exactly the same. Instead of seeing the screen, we just see the images on the screen, or instead of seeing the mirror, we see the images reflected in the mirror. And I don't know if that makes sense to some of you and not to others. That's okay. None of this has to make sense. And that's, I think, the important thing to recognise. As your understanding, or let's say your practice deepens, then little bits will make more and more sense. Things click. And I've heard, I've mentioned to plenty of you before, I've heard my teacher say things 20 times over the course of 10 years, and it'll be the 21st time when I go, boom.
I agree. You said that before. Wait a minute.
100%.
Yeah. And so, whether we talk of a screen or a mirror, I guess, and again, please understand, analogies give us some insight, but none of them are accurate, because they're all ideas within the mind. And as soon as the mind gets involved, we come to a point of contraction, of limitation. But they're sometimes helpful or a little bit instructive to help us at least have some idea of what it is that we should be alert to. So, if we use the analogy of the mirror, you can have a mirror in front of you looking at, the face. When you're looking at it, do you say, oh, there's me, or do you say there's a mirror? Does that make sense to anyone? Like, what do we actually see? We look in the mirror and go, oh, there's me. There's a mirror. You're reflected in the mirror. But because we've been looking in the same mirror for so long, or looking at the same screen for so long, we've forgotten that the screen's there or the mirror's there, and we're just focusing on the images. We've forgotten to step back and see the whole picture. So instead of seeing the screen or the mirror of consciousness, of pure awareness, we're focused on the images within consciousness. The body and the mind are the images within consciousness. The phenomenal world is the image within consciousness. And if that sounds airy-fairy, and again I've mentioned this before, but I think it's because we've got a few new folks, it's very informative. I remember about 5 or 6 years ago, I was doing a bit of research I was actually trying to find a quote I'd found where there was I couldn't find it at the time, but there was a conference of neuroscientists, and the keynote speaker started his speech by saying, we never experience the world, we only ever experience our senses. And what I wanted to add to that was that we never actually experience our senses, we actually only ever experience our mind's interpretation of our senses. So taking it back a step further, because again, we can all experience the senses, but what's cold for one person will be hot to another, what's smooth to one person will be rough to another. So actually our mind's interpretation of the senses is actually more important than the senses, or equally important. So that was the quote I was looking for, but in searching for that, what I found was a professor of ophthalmology in America, and he wrote a paper talking about how he was frustrated with the lack of progress in restoring sight to the blind. And he said, the problem is we're just looking at fixing the eyes rather than recognising that the eyes actually aren't important. And this comes back to what I was saying about everything being a mental construct. And he said, when I get my first year students into my first class, I say to them, okay, you understand how an eye works, right? So let's just put the science aside for a moment. And he says, now look at the furthest thing away from you. And of course they're in lecture theatre, so they're looking a fair way into the distance. Have you focused on the furthest thing away from you? Yep. He says, okay, now understand that somewhere beyond that is the inside of your skull. Now, this guy's speaking purely from a medical viewpoint. The inside of your skull is somewhere beyond the furthest thing you can see. Because what you're seeing as the room is actually a mental construct in your brain. Your brain has taken light images, flipped them upside down, taken them through your retina, through the optic nerve, into your brain, then your brain has created a sense of space and colour, but it's all happening within your skull. Comes back to what I said. We never experience the world, we only ever experience our mind's interpretation of the senses. The world is an illusion, it's a mental construct. But we've become so infatuated with the image on the screen that we've forgotten to step back and see the mirror or the screen for what it is, and see the images in the screen or the mental construct within the mind. Kind of interesting, eh? But I remember when I read that the first time, the teachings of yoga were not unfamiliar to me, but to read this guy saying, now, remember that the inside of your skull is somewhere beyond the furthest thing you can see, that was like, whoa! Purely from a medical viewpoint. No philosophy, no psychology, purely medical. But the problem, I'm going to wind things up because we've run over time, as always happens with these things, I do apologise. But again, the problem I think we have in our modern science is we look at everything piecemeal. So the ophthalmologist only says, wow, the inside of your skull is somewhere beyond the furthest thing you can see, and then stops there and figures how he can fix that with his eyes. He doesn't take that further and go, well, hang on, what implications does that have for everything? Because I think all of our sciences, psychology being another one, physics, come on, quantum physics, what's that telling us now about the nature of reality? That the observer changes the nature of reality, that physical matter doesn't actually exist, that you can be in two places at the same time. These are all scientific discoveries that 100 years ago, when they were spoken of philosophically, people were going, well, that's a load of nonsense. All of our sciences have the potential to take us to the same realisation of the self. It's just that we stop because we've compartmentalised all of our science into, you study this, you study that, you study that, stay within your box, and don't realise that there's a whole big picture that you're all looking at from different perspectives. And yoga is a science. It's a science of turning our attention within so that instead of focusing just on the images, we start to see the screen. And we start to recognise that that's all it really is. The blank screen is the same for all of us. Consciousness remains changeless and unchanging for all of us. And within consciousness, everything in the manifest world is experienced, is expressed, is lived, and then passes away. And yet we remain as consciousness, which is actually who and what we are. And using that simple analogy I gave before, when we've been sitting in the car for 12 hours, it might have gotten really comfortable and we might be operating on automatic, but when we get out of the car, we don't go, oh, I'm supposed to be still the car, aren't I? So our yoga practice is one of recognising that whilst we're in the car, whilst we're still embodied, we're not actually part of the car. Whilst we're moving through the body in the phenomenal world, we're not actually the body. The body is within us, not the other way around. All of our experiences are within consciousness. And consciousness is the only absolute truth. And everything that we search for externally is there as part of our fundamental nature. But because the voice is very quiet, the louder noises of the mind mask it. Who wants to look at a boring blank screen when there's all these flashy colours and explosions and stuff going off, right? From the outside, the nature of the self is really boring because there's nothing going on. There's nothing happening. There's no change. It's just a homogeneous oneness. So from the outside it seems boring, but from the inside it's awesome. Because it's everything you've always wanted. Everything you've always strived for. Everything that you thought you needed to get from someone or something else. And it's actually what you are. And our practice is simply a series of tools to help us reconnect with our true nature, with what we are. Starting with making some shapes and paying attention to what your body's doing. And then paying attention to what your breath's doing. And then paying attention to what your mind's doing. And learning to let the voices, in particular, let the voices of the mind, of the ahamkara, just slowly fade into the background like a noisy child that you can only ignore in order to make them go away. If you pay attention to them by saying go away, or if you pay attention by giving them what they want, they just keep coming back. But as soon as you ignore them, they eventually just lose interest and fade into the background. And that's what our practice is teaching us to do. To not pay attention to the flashy lights and the loud noises. to let them just of their own accord subside, to run out of their, to use up their energy, and then to simply come back to stillness. And again, that analogy that's often given of throwing a rock into a pond. You throw the rock in and the ripples move out, but eventually they dissipate because they only have a certain amount of energy, and once that energy has been completely dissipated, the pond becomes still again. But if you keep chucking more rocks in, the pond stays turbulent. And so that's what we're learning to do, to stop throwing rocks in the pond of the mind, to stop paying attention and feeding it. So we use it when we need to, and when we don't need to, we leave it alone and let it settle. Make sense, perhaps? And not make sense on other levels. So does anyone have anything else before we wind up?
Thank you.
No, thank you all very, very much, folks. It's lovely to be able to share with you. Thank you so much for coming along. Thank you all for your questions. Please don't believe anything I told you. Discover it for yourself. You only have to trust me enough to apply the practices, and everything else you find out for yourself. There's no faith required here. Once you know it within your own heart and mind, there's no faith required. There's no trust required because you know it. So don't believe me because I told you. Just believe me enough to apply the tools and you'll discover it for yourself. That's all. That's the only trust I ask for. Thanks, folks. Catch you next time.